author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Donald Trump facing 91 felony counts across 4 indictments plus civil cases. Can he survive through to the election? Well, that's what we're going to examine today. All of Donald Trump's legal travails here on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. To kick off our litigation special, we're joined by none other than Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, a constitutional attorney, a well-dressed, dapper man about town, and host of the excellent Uprising podcast, Mr. Scott DeCosenza, Esquire. Welcome back to the show, Scott.
Thank you so much, Mark. My pleasure.
So I'm super excited about this one. We're going to be talking. New York. We're going to be talking Florida. We're going to be talking Washington D.C. And later on in the show, our superstar segment, we are going to be talking Georgia and Miss Fani Willis and the utter implosion of a Trump prosecution, which it's just tickled me no end, just the ineptitude about that. But we'll be talking about that later in the show. But Scott, the one I want to start on is Jack Smith, special counsel Jack Smith, prosecuting Donald Trump in the District of Columbia, the nation's great capital city, district, let's call it, and how that case is going. Now, this week, we had the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals reject Donald Trump's claim of presidential immunity from this prosecution. Now, that was expected, wasn't it, Scott?
Oh, I think the smart money bet was that the D.C. panel would reject Trump's claim. It was a 3-judge panel populated by 2 Joe Biden appointees and 1 Herbert Walker Bush appointee. And I don't know anybody who thought that the 2 Biden judges would rule in favor of Trump. But
it did seem an unlikely push. However, yeah. So what everybody's kind of expecting now, and tell me if I got this wrong or right, because I always like to be told I'm right, don't we all, is that Trump could either appeal that decision to the full D.C. Circuit Court, which I guess that's an en banc review, is it called? En banc? Or he could go straight for a Supreme Court appeal. Now, my guess is that he goes for the en banc one simply because it draws it all out. Is that right?
People who lose their case in the courts of appeals can go to the Supreme Court, or the way the courts of appeals work, as you say, or I think as I said, it was a 3-judge panel that reviewed this case, which is typical of appeals court, D.C., which is typical of courts of appeals treatment from district courts. And then those appeals go to the Supreme Court. But in particularly noteworthy cases, namely cases which are called cases of first impression, which I think I told you about the other day, which is the case here. No appellate court has ruled on this case, and the Supreme Court hasn't spoken on it. Excuse me, I said this case, I meant this issue of presidential immunity from prosecution for acts committed, according to Donald Trump, in furtherance of the office of president. So it's incumbent upon appeals courts to use their en banc review when they're dealing with cases of first impression. That's in their own rules. So we expect that they would take it. And en banc just means as a whole, the whole body of the court, meaning all of, or at least most of, the serving judges on that court. I think it's 16, Mark. And as I understand the trend now, that senior judges often don't sit for en banc review. So it may be some less than the number 16. But in any case, lots of judges, including some that were appointed by President Trump, if that review happens. And then, yes, you're right. The reason why Trump might favor that, even if the result he expects would be the same, and I would expect, by the way, for him to lose during en banc review, because of the makeup of the court, is more liberal judges rather than conservative ones. But even still, it's going to take some time for them to hear the case. It's not like they just review the record. There would be another argument presentation, and as you might imagine, to get 16 people just to get all their emails returned and everything else is quite a feature compared to 3. So that would all accrue to Trump's benefit to delay. But in terms of getting a win, he's more likely to get that win at the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty much what I figured based on my extensive reading of Scott DiCosenza's writings on the pages of libertynation.com. I do recommend you go and check out his writing. It's full of in-depth information. You can sound as well informed as I am, dear listeners, perhaps more because you might even understand most of it. So, Scott, what this means, we should hope, what this means for the Donald Trump case in D.C., the one being brought by Jack Smith. I believe the judge has already suspended the case until all of this presidential immunity question is settled. Is that right?
As soon as yes, that is right. The explanation for that is while the case was ongoing, during what's called this interlocutory appeal, an appeal that takes place not after the conclusion of a case, but during the case, all progress on that case was suspended. And then the actual trial date was the Super Tuesday Eve trial date was canceled. So that was the big win for Donald Trump, who we all presumed, his legal goal is, of course, not only to beat the case, but he doesn't need to beat the case if he can wait until after the November elections and win those elections. Then he doesn't have to worry about beating the case in court, presumably.
Yeah. So essentially, then nothing is going to happen with the DC case until and after a ruling eventually comes down from the Supreme Court, and we don't know when that will be.
Let's interrupt that train because that's not exactly true.
Okay.
The reason why it's not exactly true is because of a wrinkle in the ruling from the 3-judge panel at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which short-circuited the usual 90-day window for appeals to be taken to the Supreme Court. So what the judges said, and the very highly regarded conservative lawyer Jonathan Turley pointed this out on his Twitter, which is where I got it from, which is that the court said they have only until Monday the 12th, the Trump team, and to file their Supreme Court case. Now, they won't lose an appeal if they file after the 12th. It's not like you have until the 12th to do it or else you lose your appeal. They have until the 12th, and if they don't file it by then the Judge Chutkan in the D.C. Circuit Court, where the trial is going to be held, may resume progress in the case to getting to trial. So the smart money then, of course, expects that Donald Trump will, in fact, have filed that appeal by the 12th in order to stall any further proceedings in the district court.
It seems to me that I mean, I might be completely wrong here, but isn't that somewhat prejudicial to Donald Trump in terms of giving him the same rights that any other defendant would have in terms of the period between appeals? Because if it's the usual 90 days, but they've short-circuited that in their decision, that three-judge panel, isn't that, I mean, that seems a little unfair to Donald Trump that they would single him out.
I think a close and sober examination of all of the ongoing cases against Donald Trump yield a sense, Mark, that perhaps fairness to the defendant wasn't the primary purpose of engaging in the litigation.
I know. I'm forever hearing the phrase "justice delayed is justice denied," but by the same token, justice rushed is probably justice screwed over. I would guess. Now, Scott, we're going to be right back with Scott DiCosenza, continuing looking at Trump's legal travails. We'll be back talking the New York City cases against him. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on extended special edition Liberty Nation Radio discussing Trump's legal travails. Now, in the first segment, we were talking about Jack Smith, the Washington, D.C. case. Now we're moving just a little further up the coast to New York City, where Donald Trump's actually facing two big cases, although only one of them with felony indictments on the docket. Scott, thanks for coming back. Now, New York City, that's Trump's home turf. Well, that's his former home turf before he and just about everybody else moved out with any wealth moved out of the city. But there's two cases there, Scott. Could you give us a quick rundown on what both those cases are?
Well, the criminal trial, of course, is more serious because there's criminal jeopardy that's attached to it. And that is that the New York District Attorney Alvin Bragg wants to put Donald Trump in a cage for the crime of a hush money payment that he made to Stormy Daniels to conceal the existence of an extramarital dalliance he made with her that she was threatening to reveal for payment by basically tabloid payment. It was exploring the notion that maybe Mr. Trump would like to conceal this by paying money. She hired a lawyer to threaten. It's basically a legal way.
Sorry, let me just jump in. Was that lawyer Mr. Michael Avenatti, prisoner 92410?
He came afterwards. This other lawyer was before right. Avenatti, and he specialized
24601. I should have said, right? Jean Valjean. Sorry.
She knew who to go to. This person specialized in basically helping young women extract money payments from people who they had sexual relations with, who wished to conceal that fact. And the women were threatening, basically, like I said, it's like a legal way to bribe somebody. Like, oh, this person's going to write an autobiography detailing, their sexual conquest.
If only she was so busy shopping that she didn't have time to do it.
So that's what it comes from. He paid the money, and it came from a corporate account, and like the labeling on the payment or something like that was the fig leaf that Mr. Bragg has used to prosecute Donald Trump. Again, this is one of those, like many of the instances in the cases against Donald Trump. This is using a law in a way it has never been used before to prosecute somebody. Again, not because of who they are or their politics, Mark, but just to represent the interests of the people. Obviously, the fantastic amount of resources that are being spent by the New York DA's office could not be better used, to other purposes.
I'm sorry, my computer recording equipment is slowing down because of all the sarcasm being stuffed into its circuit boards. Now, so that's 34 counts, I believe. 34 felony counts based on a single payment. It's really like it's a multiplier thing. It's like, well, there was some paperwork, and then there was some paperwork about the check, and then there was the check, and then there was the check went to this, and then it went to that, and all of these have kind of multiplied into, as you say, a novel application of a law, which is it's quite fascinating. But the more fascinating
for those who appreciate irony, Mark, if you can put a pin in what you were just about to say. In New York State, they've now opened up these marijuana stores where people can legally buy marijuana, but they gave the licenses out only to minority applicants who were convicted of drug crimes in New York. So the famous Rockefeller laws made it out like it was perhaps one of the worst things you could do besides kill somebody in New York was to deal drugs. And they rewarded only the people who were so bad at doing so that they got caught and convicted of crimes with their thing. And in the same breath, they're prosecuting Donald Trump to the ends of the earth for this paperwork violation that he used, again, to conceal the payment of an to conceal an extramarital affair. It is, and also has nothing whatsoever to do with the fact that they're opposed to him politically. Don't ever say that. Because one thing is for sure.
The computer's freezing up with that sarcasm again. Okay, now there's also the other case in New York City that's being brought by Letitia James, as she said she would when she campaigned for office.
How dare you, Mark? That has nothing to do, again, with politics.
Just background.
It's just about justice.
So anyway, she's going after him. Now, this is a civil case. It's a non-jury trial. Judge Arthur Engeron has already declared that Trump is guilty, but now, at the moment, what's going through is what the punishment will be. And I think this is really fascinating because one of the punishment options that's been floated.
This is not a criminal trial, by the way, just to reiterate.
Civil trial.
When you say the punishment, you mean the dollar amount he's going to assess.
Well, it's not just the dollar amount, is it? That's the key. That's why this is important. Because there's a potential that whatever is done to Donald Trump through the order of the court, the judge, he could lose, him and his family could lose the right to operate businesses in New York City. And the question that everybody has got to be asking, and if they're
in
not,
New York State, not just the
New
city,
York
the whole
State,
Yeah.
even worse than I thought. The question that everybody has to be asking themselves is, would they ever choose to open a business in New York State, knowing that if they have the wrong politics, and let's be fair, what is the wrong politics changes day by day. They might get gone after, if I may use that term. They might get gone after by the prosecutors in the city for something that, now I may have this entirely wrong, but it seems that every business person seems to be saying this is an egregious attack on Donald Trump. All the business people are saying this because to make your business look and sound good when you're applying for a loan or an insurance thing is par for the course, and it's up to the lender to do due diligence. But in this case, everybody made money, including the lenders. So it seems to me that people, New York City and New York State, are making the Empire State a particularly dangerous place to do business. What's
Mark,
your
I
thoughts
have
on that?
long demanded that my fellow Americans insist that prosecutors not be allowed to run for office after their terms in office as prosecutors, because so many of them use that office to facilitate their political goals and not the interests of justice, in my view. Sadly, my influence on these matters hasn't extended past the front door of my home with wide agreement.
It's extended into the homes of everybody listening, coast to coast, on the Radio American Network, to Liberty Nation Radio.
But we've seen this time and time again from across, both sides of the political spectrum. In this instance, certainly it is movement, progressive Democrat using their power against the anti-establishment Donald Trump, seemingly, Mark, not to facilitate any kind of justice, but to punish him, like Letitia James said she would during her campaign for office over and over again. She tried, never forget that she tried, that her remedy, she said that the NRA was beset by corruption at the top of its ranks. And instead of saying that it needed to be cleaned out for the benefit of its millions of members, she said it needed to be shut down. And she's diametrically opposed to the political ends of it. It's literally the same as if the NAACP was headquartered in a conservative state and the district attorney for that, or the attorney general rather for that state, found out that the head of it was stealing money from the members, and instead of prosecuting that person, tried to shut down the organization. That's what Letitia James thinks. Again, and I have to say it with a straight face, says, don't think this has anything to do with politics or party identification. It's simply a search for justice and a demand that the people follow the law.
We'll be back after this short break, looking at the Florida case and the much-awaited Georgia case. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back here on Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're joined once again by Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor, Scott DeCosenza. Now, earlier in the show, we've been talking about Donald Trump's legal travails. So we talked about the Washington, D.C. prosecution, we talked about the New York prosecution, and the New York civil trial. Later in the show, we are going to be talking Georgia and Miss Fani Willis, District Attorney Fani Willis. But right now, I want to dive into what's happening in Florida, because Trump, and this one has been so under the radar, Scott, that most people seem to have forgotten that it's even happening. The Florida case.
I forgot about it myself, Mark. Of all the cases, you do lose track sometimes.
Let me posit a reason.
The search warrant document case, right?
Yeah, that's right. The classified documents allegedly found in Donald Trump's Mar-a-Lago retreat. So this case, it just seems to have gone under the radar. Nobody's talking about it. And if I may, Scott, I'd like to posit a reason why, and I'd like you to tell me if my reasoning is sound. There's an election. Donald Trump is facing felony charges for hanging on to classified documents that he says he declassified simply by the virtue of being the president. And on the other side, Joe Biden is also running for office for his second term. And he was found to have multiple locations where he had classified documents, but without the defense of having been the president when he took those documents and stored them in his garage, not actually in his Corvette, which he did note in public that the Corvette is often locked. The convertible Corvette is often locked, but in the garage next to those things, among other places. So my theory, and I might be wrong here, is that the reason it's not getting any airplay is because it looks much worse for Joe Biden in optics than it does for Donald Trump. Now, the legal aspects, I don't know, Scott, which is why I turn to you. But I think the reason it's not getting any play at all in the media is because optically it looks worse for Joe Biden than Donald Trump.
So my only comment that to push back on
Sure.
your supposition there is it indicates that the media is unwilling, that the kind of big box mainstream media is unwilling to display a off the charts 100 out of 10 fantastic degree of hypocrisy in their coverage. And I think they are, Mark.
Yeah.
So I think that they would have no trouble covering on the front page above the fold, first off the headline, Trump story, and then literally just not mentioning the Biden story at all. That's part of the reason why I think Liberty Nation even exists, is because we stick a finger in the eye of that hypocrisy, rather than just sort of don the shirt of another team. So that's why I think you might be wrong about that. I would guess it's probably just a weaker case, would be my supposition, but I don't know the answer.
So Robert Hur, the no relation to Ben Hur, or maybe there is. He may come from a long line of chariot racers.
Or the
But he
potato
is the.
chip heir,
I'm sorry.
or the potato chip, the great potato chip company. Maybe you don't even know that.
I don't know the potato chip
Okay.
company. My knowledge only
Yeah.
extends so far, Scott.
Yeah, you're no American, my friend.
So the Robert Hur Special Counsel investigation into the Joe Biden document dumps, let's call them. That is due to conclude quite soon. And chatter from the White House is that they think it's going to look bad optically for Joe Biden if pictures are released when the report is released. Now, let's be very clear. There's been no indication at all that Robert Hur is looking to bring charges against Joe Biden. So I guess there's two elements there. Clearly, a lot of people are going to draw a distinction between Robert Hur and that there might be that there are in fact charges against Donald Trump for what could be essentially seen as the same thing by the public. And of course, there's the infamous picture that I presume it's the FBI, they laid out those documents on the floor and took a picture of it and released it on social media. And that looked terrible. It's like, look at Donald Trump with all these documents, as if Donald Trump, laid those documents out on the floor in that order to be photographed, which was clearly ridiculous at the time. But that didn't stop people then inferring that he has no respect for classification nor for the rule of law. Now, if photos come out of craggy, soggy cardboard boxes shoved next to a Corvette, that could look bad for Joe Biden, whether the level of criminality is reached in his case or not.
When you mentioned the photographs earlier about and saying that the chatter at the White House was that they weren't looking forward to the release of photos, I thought immediately of the photos from the Trump raid and thought to myself, Mark, well, they needn't worry about it because they're not going to be displayed with as much in his pornographic
artistry, let's call it,
layout as possible, like the Trump raid was. I'm sure that was, they probably called in like some art director. No, it's not. It's not vulgar enough. It doesn't look.
They called in a Hollywood producer to get the photographs right, like they did with January 6th. Right?
Yeah. So you may be right that that's something they're bracing against, but I suspect that they will shine in comparison to the photographs that from the Trump raid because of who controls the taking of the photos and their release, which is to say, Joe Biden and his lieutenants.
Scott, let's wrap up this particular topic here with one final question, if you may. And that is, Trump's defense on this is that as president, he had the right to declassify any information and all information that he wanted. Dan, now, if I may borrow a line from a movie I'm sure everybody loves, does the defense hold water?
Yeah, I appreciate that my cousin Vinny reference, to be sure. The As I understand the the counter to President Trump and his claim of declassification is that he didn't go through some process of declassification, that if he had declassified them, that the law says he can do so by doing X, Y, and Z. And Trump's claim is that he doesn't have to alert any office or secretary or any kind of commission that a document is declassified for him to have legally declassified it. The second that he hands it over to a person who doesn't have classified access, he has declassified it for that person, and he cannot be charged. He's the president, literally the last and ultimate decider of classification arguments for matters concerning the United States government. And so he doesn't have to do anything to declassify. He just does it by virtue of willing it. And that seems to be how it should work, given the way that the law works with respect to declassification. Otherwise, you'd have the supreme executive authority being subject to what?
A rubber stamp situation.
Right, exactly right. Some bureaucratic thing that doesn't make any sense. So I think that is the argument. And certainly the storage thing, you could argue, he didn't do in a way that most Americans would be happy about, given the prevalence of intelligence, foreign intelligence attempts to examine things. But
absolutely right. But in his defense, and it's not our place to defend either one of these presidents who are running for office. But in his defense, Donald Trump, as far as I know, does not own a Corvette.
It is our place, I think, to defend the process and to demand from all administrations that they not engage in political prosecutions. And we can do that for the Biden administration, and if there's a future Trump administration, will demand it of them too.
Absolutely right. Now we're going to be right back with Scott DeCosenza for my favorite recent topic, Fani Willis in Georgia. Don't go anywhere, folks.
We dismiss history at our peril. Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome back to Liberty Nation Radio. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our Trump's legal trials, and we're here at what I would presume is probably the case that's captured America's attention the most. Scott DeCosenza joining us. And that is the Fulton County District Attorney, Fani Willis. Apparently I've pronounced that right. Not that it really matters, I suppose. Fani Willis prosecuting Donald J. Trump, but for election overthrowing crimes, with the RICO statute.
Another prosecution, Mark, that is not political in any way. It's just about justice for the citizens of Fulton Judicial District in Georgia, and now all the citizens of the state of Georgia.
Lucky citizens of Fulton County and Georgia. Now, Scott, this case has been just a whirlwind recently with accusations and filings and responses, and it's quite the melodrama. This should be televised. This whole thing, the revolution will be televised. No, this should be serialized and turned into a new Falcon's Crest style show. Scott, give us the rundown of what's happening most recently in this case.
I believe Lorenzo Lamas is probably available if he's still alive. Well, the big news that came out was the filing of Fani Willis's disclosure about her relationship with Mr. Nathan Wade, the prosecutor.
That was a forced disclosure, though, right? She had to answer.
So one of the defendants, Donald Trump has many co-defendants.
Yeah, Mike
in the
Roman.
RICO case.
Yeah.
Excuse me?
Mike Roman.
Right. So Donald Trump has many co-defendants in his RICO case, and Mike Roman, his attorney, filed this challenge to the indictment, alleging that Fani Willis's extramarital affair with Nathan Wade and the financial relationship that her office has with him poisoned the indictment, among other things, and asked for a hearing. And the judge said, Well, we'll see about the hearing, but first let's get, Ms. Willis on the record. She declined to comment to the press, which was a new thing for her. She's very much interested in getting information about her case into the press, but not a defense of her own actions. She did go before a famous church in Atlanta, famous in the civil rights movement, and in a mock in
A letter to
letter to
God.
God. Right.
Yeah.
That was, yeah. Discussed her travails and the how she's been set upon by critics because of this prosecution, but basically disavowing any kind of poor behavior on her part. Then we have the disclosure, Mark. The disclosure to the court that she had a personal relationship. It actually was widely reported that she admitted having a sexual relationship, which I didn't take from the disclosure. And actually, that's an important point to drill down on. I think it was a mistake for her just not to admit it, if that is the nature of her relationship, because personal relationships are not the same as sexual relationships in terms of the level of bias and favoritism we might expect that would be on offer, right? For people that are physically intimate rather than just socially good friends. So in any case, that's one component of the filing. Another, and we've spoken about this, is the fantastically ham-fisted and amateurish way that she has chosen to try to prove the bona fides of her chosen prosecutor, Mr. Nathan Wade, whom she has paid a princely sum over and above what would be considered market rates for his services. Also, he's very likely totally 100% unqualified to bring this type of prosecution. That's part of the revelations we're talking about.
Something occurred to me with this. So Trump is facing rather uniquely a RICO charge, which is what they use to prosecute mafia bosses, because
the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act is where it takes its name.
So here's what's occurred to me, right? It's alleged that Willis began her affair in 2019, and the claims are that they have witnesses that they can prove this. So she hired Wade, a uniquely unqualified individual, to work a case, skipping the procedure of getting him approved by the Fulton County Board.
Let's just put a pin in that for a second and say she didn't hire him to be an employee of her office.
Sure.
She agreed
outside counsel
to hire him as outside counsel, meeting a very high fee structure.
So she hired him as an outside counsel for this, whilst having an affair with him, paying him top dollar, as you pointed out, presumably knowing that some of that would come back to her in the form of either nice evenings out, holidays, which apparently they've said that they have evidence for and witnesses for.
Mr.
Now, let me get to
does
this.
not.
Sorry. And so she would receive something from that relationship other than the companionship. Now, I'm not a legal scholar, but if someone somewhere were to suggest that Fani Willis be tried for a crime, I would suggest that would be a RICO statute, because she's receiving a benefit by a third party. Now, is that just my irony bone feeding me wrong think, or does that make any sense?
I'm sure that a politically motivated prosecutor who is a Republican, who doesn't care about justice so much as politics, like I suspect Ms. Willis does, could bring that charge. I want you to know, though, that Mr. Nathan Wade doesn't spend all his money on haberdashery, and I think that he does spend quite a bit on trips for himself and Ms. Willis. So that's another component of the overall charges for people who haven't dialed in very closely, is that not only did she get her lover paid a lot of money, in itself a violation of legal ethics and what might prompt a dismissal of those indictments. But then there's the other matter that some of it actually came back to benefit her in the terms of lavish vacations and trips that Mr. Wade paid for her benefit.
She was just really wetting her beak, Scott. Just wetting her beak.
It's all compounding,
Sure.
And it's one of those things where the closer you look at it, the more there is to see and be astonished at, I think.
So I got two follow-ups here, Scott. So first one is what happens next, essentially. But the second one, actually, let's do the second one first. So she in her filing, she tried to explain the bona fides of Mr. Wade and why he was qualified.
Right.
Yeah, I think could you run
It's
those
so
by us,
staggering,
please?
Mark. I was howling laughing when I saw it because of what it revealed about Ms. Willis. My initial thought was that Mr. Trump should stop trying to get them to quit the prosecution, because the best thing that can happen for him is to go forward with an incompetent prosecutor. The reason why is because if Mr. Wade, so how this works, just a brief aside, is once the grand jury investigation is complete and they bring the charges, which is what has happened, the charges are brought in the name of the state of Georgia versus Donald Trump, right? Not the judicial count, not the Fulton County Judicial District or Ms. Willis personally, but the state of Georgia. So what happens is, if those prosecutors are tossed off the case, now the judge could say the indictment is bad and you have to go back to stage 1 or 0 rather, resetting the clock and presumably scuttling the charges altogether. Or they could say the charges will go forward, but without Mr. Wade or Ms. Willis being involved. If that happens, then a state prosecutor who has competency in RICO prosecution will be assigned by a kind of collective group of prosecutors. I think it's called the Georgia State Prosecutors Association. But that association, Mark, presumably will get a competent prosecutor to helm this case, who may actually be good at getting a conviction. And we know for sure that Ms. Willis' choice of Mr. Wade is not competent because of her filing. In order to justify his rate and saying that he's qualified to do this, among other things, they posted a picture of a Lucite award like you might get from a trophy store for $19 or $22.
That's $22 engraved.
and in 2019 dollars as well, sure. I think. So you have to consider that with the Biden inflation we're dealing with.
$6.
So like an award, a participation award, it would be like literally another one of the presentations was like if you were trying to get somebody certified as a firearms expert before a court and took a photograph of their NRA membership card, like somehow that was their bona fides. That's the level of it's staggering, Mark. And what I thought is staggering, not only that was the case, meaning that was the evidence that they were going to present, but that she doesn't understand how bad it makes her look. In other words, you presumably would post your best evidence of his qualifications in this type of thing. And if that's your best, oh my God.
Yeah, it shows a certain amount of, and I'm sure she's far smarter than me. She became the Fulton County DA, but it shows a level of naivety and a lack of understanding of optics, which politically is just, I mean, that's political suicide right there, I think, Scott. Scott DiCosenza, I want to thank you ever so much for being on the panel today, being the panel today, more like. We appreciate you being here. I hope you had as much fun as I have. Cheers.
I did. Thank you, Mark.
And that's all we have time for on this week's special edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'd like to thank Scott DiCosenza, host of the Uprising podcast, which you can check out at any good podcast provider or indeed on the page of libertynation.com, for joining us today and being the fount of all knowledge on all things legal and all things Donald Trump. And of course, I want to thank you at home, the listeners, for taking the time to tune in for what I hope you felt was an informative and fun edition. Thanks for being here. We'll catch you next week. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are LibertyNation.com.